Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Ingrid Kutsia, and I'm going to be the moderator today for our webinar on financing greener cities of the future. And we're looking at resource mobilization, nature-based solutions in cities. If you can just move on to the next slide, please. What we're wanting to do today is just explore some rather interesting ideas. We live in its urban century, and we know that there are a lot of pressures on our planet and our communities this time, particularly demands in terms of infrastructure, water, food, other needs. And cities today are under increasing pressure to address all of these, particularly as COVID has now meant that they need to come up with recovery plans and redesign their cities to ensure that they are more sustainable and more resilient. And in this context, we find that there's a growing need to be more effective and innovative in how we leverage resources and finances and investments to protect nature in our cities on the one hand, but also to meet the growing challenges around infrastructure and services. So before I introduce our very great panel of speakers this afternoon, just some quick house rules. You will see as attendees that your video and mics have been muted. This is just to keep the bandwidth open. Our session is being recorded, so by participating in this webinar, you are consenting to be recorded. And then the last point just to make is that we will have opportunity for questions. So if you do have a question, please write it into the Q&A box, the question and answer box. And we will monitor the Q&A box, and we will try and answer as many of the questions as we can at the end of our panel discussion. If you can just switch to the next slide. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to have a series of very short interventions from our various speakers, looking at the topic from different perspectives. And then, as you see, there will be a panel discussion at the end. And if you take me to my next slide, I would just like to introduce our very impressive lineup of speakers. Very quickly, we have, and I'm not sure how they look on your gallery on the screen, but if you look at the slide from left, we have Tracy Cumming from UNDP BioFin. We have Katja Karasakis from the OECD, Mark Go from Capitals Coalition, Kimberly Pope from the World Economic Forum, and Alok Barnwell from the GEF. So we really are very happy and excited to have such experts here with us, and I'm looking forward to a very lively discussion. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Tracy Cumming. As I said, she's from UNDP, but she's also at the moment serving on the CBD's expert panel on resource mobilization. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tracy. Thank you so much. Over to you, Tracy.
Thanks, Ingrid, and hello, everyone. So Ingrid has asked me to touch on the BioFin and the CBD panel of experts approach to resource mobilization. And I'd like to do that by essentially touching on three things. Firstly, our conceptual framework, which I think is fundamental to this work. Secondly, the actual practical approach that BioFin takes. And thirdly, if I've got time, to just zoom into one or two examples that I think are quite relevant for cities. So firstly, that conceptual framework. BioFin, in the BioFin world, which BioFin stands for the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, we talk about 4 outcomes of resource mobilization. These can essentially be collapsed into 3 components of resource mobilization, which is what the CBD panel of experts talks about. And these 3 are all interconnected, and they're all very important to consider when you walk into the space of resource mobilization. The first thing is reduce or redirect resources causing harm to biodiversity. The second is generate additional resources. And the third is enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of resource use. We seem to be far more familiar with the second component, generating additional resources. Let's get more money, which is important, but it is not the whole story. And we can't just focus on this. Katja hopefully will explain why it is even more important to look at resources that are causing harm to biodiversity and to do better with the very limited resources that we have. So that's a very high level conceptual approach, and I think it might be useful to keep that framework in mind as we discuss this topic going forward. My second area I want to touch on is the biofin approach in the sense of how biofin goes about doing this work at a country level. We don't believe that it is particularly useful to parachute into a country with the latest and most exciting and sexiest new innovative finance mechanism and try and force this onto any given situation, whether it's a national level or a local level, it's city or a rural area. Our approach starts with first understanding the drivers of biodiversity change, the positive and the negative drivers, and particularly, obviously, the economic drivers of change, and understand the institutional structures and the needs that make up that particular landscape. Then we design solutions to either fix the problems or create new mechanisms to bring in new sources of funding. All of this can only be done in close collaboration with relevant governments and other stakeholders, including the Ministry of Finance. So what I'm saying here is there's no silver bullet, and you need to engage, you need to look back before you can look forward and start changing the systems you work in to improve the space of resource mobilization for nature and for nature-based solutions. Lastly, if I can just zoom into two particular mechanisms that I'm hoping will help explain some of those sort of conceptual ideas I've just put forward. The first one is mainstreaming, which we're all pretty familiar with the term, but I think it's incredibly useful at the local government level. Nature is so fundamental to the functioning of our physical world as well as the social and economic systems that we live in. And integrating nature into the way we think about how we design and run cities is crucial. Mainstreaming biodiversity into plans and budgets can reduce harmful expenditure and also generate additional revenue. For example, if there's a job creation program, this can focus on nature-based solutions that has clear biodiversity benefits. The second mechanism I want to touch on is very dear to my heart, and it's around how you can use property rates, property taxes to change behavior at a local level. Properties that are being managed in such a way so as to ensure the persistence of ecosystems that provide nature-based solutions can be exempt from paying property rates or have significantly reduced property rates, just like any other properties that provide public services. The City of Cape Town is one example where properties that are managed for conservation are specifically exempt from paying property rates. And this isn't just biodiversity for biodiversity benefits. It means that there is a substantial reduction in the risk of fires and improves water provisioning services. In this way, a city at a local level can incentivize behavior to reduce future costs that they might have to face in other areas. I know our other panelists have fantastic things to talk about, so I'm going to stop there and hand back to Ingrid.
Thank you very much, and that was really amazing, and I particularly like some of those practical examples. And in fact, I think, Tracy, the first time you and I met each other years ago was precisely around those tax incentives. Right, so our next speaker now is going to be Katja Karasakis. She works for the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in the Environment Directorate, where she leads the program on biodiversity, land use, and ecosystems. And her work focuses on the economics and the policy around biodiversity. Katja, it's all yours now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much also Ingrid, Nakara, and the team for the invitation to speak here today. And it's always a pleasure to be on a panel also with Tracy and the rest here today. So what I will cover in the next 5 minutes is, I think first I'd like to provide a quick overview of the global biodiversity finance, in a sense to provide an idea of the amount of finance, what are the main sources of finance, etc. And then I'll go a bit more closely into nature-based solutions and cities. And though biodiversity finance, which is nature finance, is not exactly the same thing as nature-based solutions, there's obviously like a big overlap in the two. So first of all, just to say that we released a report in April of this year called the Comprehensive Overview of Global Biodiversity Finance. And in that report, in the analysis, we found that global finance to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity or nature is estimated at around $78 to $91 billion a year. And if we look closer at the sources of that finance, the lion's share of that is from domestic public budgets, which accounted for approximately $68 billion a year. And again, from the total private finance for biodiversity and nature, in other words, estimated at around $7 to $13 billion a year. I would like to highlight that the data and reporting frameworks that we have today for the private finance is generally much poorer than what we have for the domestic public and the international public finance. So it's probably an underestimate, but the fact is we're really not tracking this these private sector financial flows very well at present. So just to repeat, around, let's say, $85 billion a year to protect biodiversity. We also estimated, though, the total government support that is considered harmful or potentially harmful to nature. And we found that that comes up to around $500 billion a year, so more than 5 times higher than the amount of finance and resources mobilized to protect biodiversity. So a key point there, which relates to Tracy's point as well, is that, of course, it's great to try and scale up finance for nature-based solutions. It's also really important, however, to look at the existing expenditure we have and to assess whether it is green or not. And this is especially important now in the context of COVID-19, the fact that there are many economic stimulus measures in place. A lot of money is being funneled to stimulate the economy, and this is a key opportunity to also examine, is it green? Or if it's not, it's potentially locking in for longer term non-green and harmful to nature outcomes. Just one example, just last week or the week before, France released its expenditure, its budgets for 2021, and has for the first time complemented this with an assessment of what elements of the budget are positive for the environment, neutral for the environment, and harmful to the environment. So this is just one example of new types of analysis that are actually looking at how their domestic expenditures can either be positive, neutral, or negative. So just as an example there. So in addition to this kind of big picture output, I'd like to get a little bit more into crunchier in the tools and policy instruments that you can use to help mobilize finance for nature or nature-based solutions. And one of the things that we do at the OECD is we track biodiversity relevant economic instruments and the finance they mobilize. So currently around 110 countries are providing data to our database. And the database includes instruments such as biodiversity relevant taxes, biodiversity relevant fees and charges, tradable permits, environmentally motivated subsidies, so the good ones, in other words, the green subsidies, And just to give an indication of the type of finance that can be mobilized, for example, through the biodiversity relevant taxes, we've identified that biodiversity relevant taxes mobilize approximately $7 billion a year. It's a tiny fraction of the total revenue that's generated from environmentally related taxes, but the ones that are biodiversity relevant are 7 billion. It's not a small amount. And indeed, that finance can also, from those taxes, can and is in certain cases earmarked to go back into nature conservation and sustainable use. In terms of financing also for nature-based solutions, it can be very, very useful to look at instruments such as taxes and biodiversity offsets, which are focused on the polluter pays approach. As these types of instruments also provide continuous incentives. So aside from being able to generate revenue, they also provide continuous incentives for more sustainable production and consumption patterns, which is really critical. And a point that I'd like to make also is that while it's, of course, it's important to raise finance for nature-based solutions, it's also very important to think about what policy frameworks we have in place. Finance is just one element. Regulation is also critically important. Land use planning, spatial land use planning, including mapping of ecosystem services, all these types of things are critical. So it comes together as a package. Another point, though, on the policy instruments. So I mentioned about the use of looking at polluter pays approaches. On the flip side, you have beneficiary pays approaches, such as payments for ecosystem services. And all of these types of instruments are also able to directly engage the private sector. So, for example, with payments for ecosystem services program, you can have a beverage company that gets involved with an agricultural group or a farmer in particular, and they can pay the farmer to reduce the use of chemical pesticides instead of the beverage company itself paying higher fees for water treatment facilities. So this is just one example of a type of, in effect, a nature-based solution. And again, we found that 10 of the likely largest national payments for ecosystem services programs mobilize around $10 billion a year in total. Again, this is just an indication of magnitude of potential, etc., through these types of instruments. Meanwhile, there are hundreds of other PES programs around the world, most of which are at local and regional scale, and which are mobilizing finance indeed for nature and can be also relevant for nature-based solutions. And I think then another key point just before I conclude is that another benefit of nature-based solutions themselves is that they can be much more cost-effective than gray infrastructure. So as an example, in the city of Philadelphia, they found that the net present value of green infrastructure for stormwater control ranged from between $2 to $4.5 billion a year, whereas the gray infrastructure benefits were a tiny fraction of that, much less than half a billion over a 40-year period. So tiny fraction. So nature-based solutions also offer ways to achieve your goals in a much more cost-effective manner. And finally, I'd just like to highlight that there's a lot more scope to work together with insurance companies, with financial bodies, etc., to harness better the potential for nature-based solutions as they offer multitudes of direct benefits, but also co-benefits, which non-nature-based solutions tend not to do. And so overall, it can definitely be a win-win across a range of issues. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much. And that's quite a lot to take in, but I think it's a lot of really interesting and useful instruments. Our next speaker, Mark Gow, is, as I said earlier, the CEO of Capitals Coalition, which is a global collaboration between business, governments, and civil societies that are transforming decision-making by including the value provided by nature and people. Mark also serves on several advisory boards, including the board for the economics of the TEEP, Economics of Ecosystem and Biodiversity. Mark, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just building on what Katia was saying there about how we measure these benefits that are created, because it's great to have nature-based solutions. It's quite obvious that that is the best thing to do. It sounds like the right thing to do. How do we actually measure those benefits that are going to be created? Because if we can't measure those benefits, we can't get that into some context, we're never going to convince the finance to flow. And that's exactly what we've been doing with capitals. So it's not capitals or nature-based solutions. It's not all of these things as separate parts. They're actually completely integrated. So what capitals does is it actually does that measurement and valuation bit to be able to tell you where you should do the nature-based solutions, but also the benefit that's then going to be delivered within society and to who's actually going to receive that benefit at the end. One of my bugbears at the moment, particularly because of the political landscape we're in, is that I think that some of the challenges we're facing in the world is because groups of experts, maybe like we're on the call today, thought that we knew the answers ourselves and told everyone else what the answer was. And I've been rather disappointed recently to see several consultations where the word consultation was a word rather than an action. And I think that what we need to be doing here is actually engaging with where the value is at risk, where the value is actually being felt. And that comes down to people. That comes down to actually people on the ground, and we need to be engaging with them if it's them that's going to be affected. And that's what Capitals does. It starts to allow us to understand what the value of something is. Now, don't get confused here with price. Price and cost is what we're willing to pay for something. If I'm thirsty, I might be willing to pay more for water than if I'm not thirsty. And that's when the value starts coming in. So value is the relative importance and worth of something. It's the context surrounding the decision you're making. And we've got to be clear here that a lot of the decisions that we're making at the moment are based around quantities of things. So we'll say that there's 1,000 cubic meters of water, there's 1,000 tons of carbon being produced, there's 1,000 people involved in that project. That actually doesn't give us much context. What we really need to know is what that's actually driving in society. What's the value that's being created for people? And there's lots of different projects going on at the city level, at the water level as well, watershed level. And we've got lots of organizations within the coalition that are leading that work, whether it's working with Greater Manchester in the UK, where I am at the moment, where they've done quite a lot of work looking at nature-based solutions. FTech, the consultant there, has been helping them to do that, whether it's in Palo Alto, but there's lots of places around the world, in South Africa as well, where we've been working through organizations. And what the coalition does is help to facilitate that to occur. So we bring together the governments, there's over 100 of them at the moment, that are making statements over this next year, when actually natural capital accounts at a national level will become standardized. In fact, the consultation starts on the 22nd of October, my birthday, just in case you're interested. But then that then goes on from then, and the beginning of next year, next spring, we're going to have a standard for how countries will account for natural capital. That's going to feed through to where finance is, to where business is as well. So the trajectory we see at the moment is that a lot of these initiatives that you'll be aware of over the last 5 or 6 years have very much been in a language of we could do this, we could do that. They've been very voluntary. We're now accelerating that and moving into a language of should. So actually there's some boundaries around what we should and what we shouldn't do, what is acceptable, where the thresholds are, where the science-based targets actually put this. A lot of the work that many of the other people on this panel today are doing are defining those boundaries. But what we have to do, if we're going to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals by the end of this decade, is that has to move over to must. So one of the things we're doing at the moment is we're working with the European Commission actually on changing the accounting rules. How do businesses, how do local councils, how do communities actually account for the benefits that they've got? If we change those rules, then what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to see those benefits and benefit to who, very, very easily. And that's, I think, the next stage that's going to be happening here. There's a lot more information on our website, including lots of tools. We've been getting all of the communities together and putting all of the tools that are available on the MIT Shift website, and you can find out more information about that on our website as well, including some new biodiversity guidance specifically about biodiversity, which is often left out of assessments like this because it's seen to be too complex. It's not easy to harmonize. Well, over the last 3 to 4 years, we've been working with organizations all around the world to come up with some very accessible guidance to start bringing the biodiversity metrics and approaches into these assessments to make sure it can be at the center of that. And that was only launched last week as well. Also available on our website if you want it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And a very complex topic, but I think a very important one, and certainly within the context of cities and budgets. Our next speaker is Kimberly Pope. She is the community and project lead for the Nature Action Agenda at the World Economic Forum. And this particular platform that Kimberly leads up looks at public-private cooperation and to disrupt business as usual and halt the biodiversity loss by 2030. That's quite an ambitious assignment. Kimberly, please speak now. And just a quick reminder to all our attendees, time for questions in the question and answer box, please. Thank you. Kimberly.
Hi, thanks so much, everyone. I'm just delighted to be here to talk about opportunities to finance nature-positive cities. So cities, suburbs, and the global infrastructure system have a great impact on nature, affecting nearly a third of threatened species. And cities alone are responsible for 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we must reimagine our cities. Right now, we have a vital window of opportunity for action as the COVID-19 pandemic really has challenged our assumptions about work, transportation, and city living. Cities have experienced devastating health and economic consequences from the pandemic, particularly in low-income neighborhoods. And many people have even decided, at least in the short term, to leave cities for economic or personal reasons. For those that have stayed, however, a transformation has occurred. At the height of the pandemic, we saw clean waterways in Venice, clear skies in New Delhi, and in many places, even as cities reopened, traffic was lighter. People also have found new solace in reconnecting with cities' green spaces, often their only place for exercise and entertainment. Streets were transformed. And in New York City, where, for example, I lived for 10 years, these streets may permanently stay closed, creating more spaces for outdoor eating and bike lanes. In short, many city dwellers saw just how different the relationship with nature could be, giving us a vital moment to reimagine our cities. In the World Economic Forum's recent report entitled The Future of Nature and Business, released in July of this year, we identified nature-positive transformations needed to change our cities and transform our infrastructure and built environment system. The infrastructure and built environment transitions can lead to business opportunities worth an estimated $3 trillion annually and help create 117 million new jobs by 2030. So cities can therefore be transformed for both the benefit of industry and the people that live in them. So I'm going to give 3 examples from our report of how nature-based solutions can play a role in these transitions and how to fund them. So by restoring natural ecosystems already present in and around cities, we can help transform cities' water systems, protect them from flood and extreme weather events, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So on water, in 2018, for example, Cape Town was less than 3 months away from running out of water, a so-called day zero event. Extreme rationing kept the city afloat. However, without better water systems, the city remains at risk. Indeed, according to researchers at Vector Center, at least 20 cities around the world are at risk of becoming day zero cities in the next 5 to 10 years, meaning finding solutions to cities' water problems is critical. According to the Nature Conservancy and partners, restoring Cape Town's natural watershed could provide at least 18% of the city's water supply needs at 10% of the cost, compared to human-engineered solutions like desalination and wastewater treatment, similar to what Katya was saying about how nature-based solutions can often be much more cost-effective. So the Cape Town Water Fund, which pools investments across water users, including consumers, businesses, utilities, and local governments, is spearheading rehabilitation projects across the state. In total, investing in nature-based solutions for water could save $140 billion per year and provide drinking water for 1.4 billion people by 2030, making a strong business case for investment. Another area where nature-based solutions can play a key role in city infrastructure is the conservation and restoration of coastal wetlands. Many of the world's coasts are becoming increasingly urban, and damage from flooding can be enormous. In 2012, for example, Hurricane Sandy cost the U.S. nearly $75 billion. Restored and conserved mangroves, marshes, estuaries, and natural barrier islands protect coastal cities and communities from flooding and erosion while also providing vital ecosystem services. They can also benefit the insurance industry and city and local governments by reducing flood-related costs. One innovative project to fund mangrove restoration is the Restoration Insurance Service Company, or RISCO, created by Conservation International, that is being piloted in the Philippines. RISCO is a social enterprise that invests in mangrove conservation and restoration in areas with high-value coastal assets. In the short term, RISCO will be funded by grants, equity, and loans. However, in the long term, it will be financed through annual payments from insurance companies for its risk reduction services and through blue carbon credits. Globally, restoration could reduce losses paid out by the insurance industry by up to $20 billion annually. Finally, looking back to the lockdown and COVID, let's discuss those urban green spaces, which are so vital to people living in cities. Particularly, I remember living in New York City. I think living next to Central Park saved me on many occasions. So green spaces such as urban forests, parks, roofs, and walls can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve air filtration, reduce noise pollution, cool a city, and improve health and well-being. Green roofs have these environmental and social benefits while also extending the roof lifespan. And when combined with subsidies or tax breaks, green roofs can be a long-term profitable investment. Cities that combine incentives with regulation have higher rates of green infrastructure installation. Singapore's coverage of green roofs and walls, for example, is expected to triple by 2030, and San Francisco now requires new buildings to have green roofs. In all, the green roof market is expected to be worth around $15 billion by 2050. So in sum, I think it's important to think about the business case for investment in nature-based solutions, as well as the links between nature and climate goals and how this can lead to more financing options. So I'm pleased that the World Economic Forum is launching a new partnership with the government of Colombia and others on biodiverse cities, which will support the vision for nature-positive cities, including looking at how to finance them. So I'm gonna stop there, and I look forward to the questions and hearing the rest of the discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kimberly, and for inspiring us to reimagine our cities and become more nature positive. And on this note, I'm going to invite our last speaker today, Mr. Alok Barnwell. He is the Global Environmental Facilities Senior Climate Change Specialist and Coordinator in the Sustainable Cities Impact Program. So he is just the right person to address us now and as our last speaker. Thank you, Alok.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? Great. Yeah. Thanks. The advantage of speaking last is there are many good topics covered excellently by previous speakers. So thankful to everyone. I think you covered some of the most important things that I was also trying to speak about: valuation, cost effectiveness, sources of financing. Katya, you covered really well the landscape which is there. I'll take this opportunity to really talk about, how dedicated environment funds or climate funds like the Global Environment Facility, it's supporting cities and the local governments to really integrate nature-based solutions in their urban development planning or investments. So I'll start with a quick context of, cities. Kimberly talked about the environmental degradation which has been happening, rising GHG emissions. Cities are vulnerable to climate change at the same time. And, one of the more important features is that, cities are doubling, and probably by 2050, it will be double both in population as well as in area. And various estimates suggest that 60 to 70% of infrastructure is yet to be built. And the cities are, and because of the pandemic, it's the point when cities have to really decide whether where that investment will go, what kind of infrastructure they have to really build, whether all 70% infrastructure has to be built concrete, or whether they can really look at nature-based solutions or nature-based infrastructure to ensure quality urban services for cities. And in particularly in context of cities, a combination of green and gray infrastructure, which can really not only improve effectiveness of gray infrastructure, but also help cities address many of the underlying challenges of tackling climate extremes, limiting GHG emissions, and building resilience to future pandemics. Like in the current context, the importance of open space in cities has never been so important, right? So so there is a growing realization. There is a clear understanding of what exactly is the value of nature-based solutions and importance of nature in cities. But one of the facts remain is that despite of this growing evidence, most of the evidence actually comes from the developed world cities. There are examples, but in the developing world, probably because of a number of factors, we are not seeing that many examples, and that is where funds like us are trying to work along with partners like ICLAI, C40, WRI, UNDP, UNEP, and many others to make that transition. What is encouraging is for us is that there is a strong leadership that we are seeing in the developing world about integrating nature-based solutions. And that is really driving us to provide catalytic support. So we have, Ingrid, you mentioned about the Sustainable Cities program of Jeff, which covers 50 cities across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And majority of these cities have prioritized NBS as part of their integrated approach for urban sustainability. We have also created a global platform for cities, and ICLAI, C40 and others, and World Bank and many MDBs are part of this group, which is further collaborating with other partners to address issues or emerging topics like nature-based solutions. So what exactly we are doing. So our approach is kind of twofold. We are trying to identify some of the systemic issues which are inhibiting cities to think of NBS as part of their planning. And second, I think we still need more evidence. So we are supporting cities in implementing some of those nature-based solutions to show the impact. So in terms of some of the challenges that we are trying to address, the first is, one of the major issues with cities is urban sprawl. How cities are expanding so fast, and that which is affecting nature and natural resources, though, so much. So how that can be checked, and for that, one of the fundamental approaches of our project or program is supporting cities in integrated urban planning, which is based on human system and natural system integration. We are supporting cities like Kigali, Dakar, Abidjan, in Africa, cities in Asia, to use more spatial data, satellite data, to understand the landscape, to understand what are the important natural resources which needs to be protected or which needs to be untouched, so that they can provide valuable ecosystem services. So we are supporting integrated urban planning, which can create or pave path for nature-based solutions, and investments in those kind of infrastructure. It's not just Jeff. Other financing institutions like MDBs, World Bank, AFDB, are also very much supporting these. EBRD's Green Cities program, they have this Green City Action Plans, which are really very effective in ensuring that nature system integration. So the first thing is the planning support, and where we are investing a lot in cities to ensure that NBS is at the first instance of urban development integrated, and we don't think later that now let's change our gray infrastructure to green infrastructure. The second is one of the fundamental things that we have faced while heard from cities is that nature-based solution has a jurisdictional challenge. Like often the solutions go beyond urban boundaries. Right. So and then cities themselves, they find limiting powers or decision making to take a landscape approach for nature-based solutions. And this is where we are working with a number of cities to ensure there is a greater institutional coordination between national, city governments, city versus urban versus rural governments, urban departments, and forest departments. So this is the institutional coordination that we are facilitating, and some of the cities are really leading on this. For example, Freetown. Everyone knows the mayor, the very dynamic mayor, and she has the project that we will be supporting there. She has brought in the agriculture department in the project to ensure a more integrated, planning to restore some of their wetlands and other initiatives. So that's the second one. And third is, as I said earlier, we need more evidence, more valuation. I'm glad Mark talked about the importance of valuation. We are also initiating a project with IISD in partnership with MAWA Foundation to use to really value or do dollar valuation of some of the nature-based solutions, or some examples that Kimberly mentioned. And what what we are doing is there is a financial model that has been developed by IISD called SAVI, which now integrates climate data. And using that data, we are planning to value nearly 50 projects over next few years to really come up with a comprehensive database and evidence of what how nature-based solutions can provide economic benefits. We are also, I also think that for nature-based solutions, cities need long-term financing, because often the benefits are for longer term, are realized in longer term. And for that, we are, working with some of the financing facilities like ICLIS financing facility, C40, and many others to ensure that, cities have the investment readiness to raise some of these long-term finance. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, we need to show in the cities that it works. And the 50 cities where we are supporting, and many others through our partners, we are working on restoring wetlands, expanding green spaces, the 1 million tree plantation initiative of Freetown. Cities like Brasilia and others are trying phytoremediation for cleaning water. San Jose in Costa Rica, from where our new CEO comes in, we are supporting urban biodiversity corridors to ensure that it's visible. The cost effectiveness that we are talking about is understood, and it really gets into core of urban planning. So I'll just stop here. We are fortunate to work with a number of partners, including many of those which are in the panel, and I'll be happy to share more information if you like. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Look, that's been amazing. And in fact, to all of you, I found it really great that we had some good technical information, a lot of content, but also peppered with some really great practical examples. And I think for those cities that are tuned in, that's very important. In fact, we have a question here around what are the major characteristics or differences for financing nature-based solution projects compared to financing other climate protection measures. And I would like to add to that question, what are some of the key risks that cities face in attracting finance for nature-based solutions? Who wants to give that a first bash? And look.
Sure.
Sorry.
No, not a problem at all. There are many barriers. As I said, there are some of the fundamental barriers, like the issue of understanding the value of nature-based solutions, and particularly where in developing world cities where your space is limited, where they're struggling with many challenges. Their decision making is short term, and their investment readiness is not that much. In cities like in India, Indonesia, or other part of South Asia, still cities, the urban governance is not that much decentralized. Still the finance flow is coming from top to bottom. The cities, they do not have that much of decision-making power. So there are some of these fundamental issues which are needed. And second, as I said, it's not that they are not motivated. They are there, and they probably need some of additional catalytic or financing from sources like JEF or GCF or World Banks and other development banks to really help them test it or do the transition, because the ecosystem has been very much around building grey infrastructure, right? I mean, right from how funding is allocated from the national level to the schedule of works of how infrastructure is built, for engineers and for technical people. I'm a civil engineer too, and if I remember correctly, in our schedule of works guide, there was nothing about nature-based infrastructure. It's all about concrete, right? So there is an entire the entire value chain of how infrastructure is built in cities and planned. This is where I think we need to really get into and get different set of stakeholders to really think about it and take the action. And I'm very optimistic that the valuation work that we will be doing will be focusing a lot on cities, and we'll be sourcing projects from different partners to do the valuation, and we'll try to be as diverse as possible so that we can identify some of the root causes of why finance is not flowing, why decision is not based on nature, and then try to change that.
Thank you. It looks like, Mark, you've got something to say, or you're just resetting your video.
Yeah, I was just unmuting myself. I think we've got to be aware that, I mean, it is more complex when you start looking at nature-based solutions than it would be necessarily on a climate model. And that's because climate can be aggregated into one figure. And what we're really talking about when we talk about nature is the complexity of the connections between them. The one thing that ecosystems teach us is that absolutely everything is connected. And therefore, I mean, that's one of the reasons we've united the natural and the social and the human coalitions together, is because everyone we knew that was working on nature realized quite quickly it was also related to jobs, it was related to society, and vice versa. Those that were working in the International Labour Organization, Oxfam, all those others, realized that actually they couldn't do it unless the nature bit was included. So it is more complex. We've got to be aware of that. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means we have to delve deeper into understanding those connections in order to be able to do it. And there is a lot of momentum, even in the last couple of months. The HSBC pollinator work that's just been launched has stolen our top slot on all Google alerts. If you type in natural capital now, you'll get them because they've paid a lot of money for the ad and we didn't. But that's not to say it's not good what they're doing. But there's that work. There's McKinsey has just come out with a lot of work. There's the Willis Towers Watson work. You've got BNP Paribas, which is using the capitals approach to start putting ESG metrics in. So there's lots of people that are starting to understand this and putting that effort in. I think the challenge we're going to have is actually standardizing that now. And that comes back to what I was saying earlier on. How can we do this in a consistent way so that when you're going into a financing mechanism, you know that you're getting something which is consistent across the board? Because at the moment, it's still very piecemeal in the way it's being done. But there's a lot of people out there exploring it. As long as and human beings do not have a problem with dealing with complexity. Look how we're addressing COVID, maybe not always in the best way, but we're addressing the complexity and the difficulties that we have all the time. So we can do this as well, but it just means that we need to step up a bit more.
Thanks. And I'm just wondering if there's anybody else that would like to add. I do have another related question, and it's about just sharing some insights on whether large-scale infrastructure development companies are coming to the party, as it were. Are they responding to a growing demand for a shift towards more green infrastructure as opposed to conventional grey infrastructure interventions? Anybody would like to address that?
Ingrid, I can address part of that, but not the core of it. And I'm sure other people can step in after me. I would say that the banks are coming to the party. We're getting development banks, large investment institutions really starting to step up in the space in ways that I have never seen before. A lot of challenges. Mark mentioned the ability to measure impact, and that's the first challenge. But more and more, we're getting banks saying we need to integrate biodiversity considerations into what we finance and how we finance it. And we need to look longer term at the impact that these investments have on biodiversity. And if your banks are saying that, that will fundamentally impact the developments that are being put in, because most countries can't fund that without support from financial institutions. Not all of them, but most. So I'll leave it at that. I'm sure other people want to come in as well.
Sure, I'm happy to come in as well. So I think, I've been at the World Economic Forum for about a year working on this issue, and I think I have personally seen quite a shift in talking to infrastructure companies. When I first started, it was really hard to get anyone on the phone, even to talk about nature-based solutions or even nature or biodiversity in general. I wouldn't say, it's been a watershed moment where everybody's jumping to talk about nature on a panel at Davos, but I think, there has been a shift in more infrastructure companies, whether it's pressure from the banks, whether it's pressure from cities, whether it's learning more about what's happening, what their impact is on nature. I do think that people are becoming more aware about and interested in incorporating nature in their designs. One of the things that the World Economic Forum has been working on for a while is the greening of the BRI in China and neighboring countries. So that was something that has been on the table for a while. Still a lot of work to be done, but I think in general, we're seeing a shift, and now is the time to keep the pressure up and really show companies, from managers up, how they can really make these changes to better incorporate nature in their designs. Out there.
And just briefly, if I may, that there's actually a tool we're working on at the moment. We tried to bring the infrastructure bodies together over the last 5 years. They talked about it, but we've never quite got them. We got them in the room once, but they never quite led to them doing something significant. That is changing. And there's actually the Construction Innovation Hub at the moment is developing a tool specifically for infrastructure projects. We've just finished a big project with the World Bank as well, and with the IFC there, which has just been released a couple of weeks ago, looking at projects that they've been investing in. So I do see a trend changing here, and there is more momentum.
Thanks. I've got a question directed at Katja. Do you think that the finding that domestic public budgets contribute the most to biodiversity finance can be used as grounds for international funding being diverted elsewhere?
No, absolutely not. I think that there's such a, at least in the biodiversity community, I would say, I hope, it's clear to me, I hope it's clear to others as well, that there's such a large finance gap for biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And if you look at where we are today under the Convention on Biological Diversity and the assessment through the Global Biodiversity Outlook on how we're faring in terms of the 20 Aichi targets, not one single target has been fully achieved, and only a couple have been partially achieved, and the rest we haven't. So I would say that there is a pretty, I hope this is true, globally, that there's a clear understanding that we just need to scale up our policies, scale up our finance, identify where the finances are not aligned, and makes current spending that we do have much more efficient and effective. I don't think there's any argument whatsoever in saying that one would divert the other.
Okay, great. I have some questions of my own also, and I was just wondering that if I were a mayor, what would your advice be to me? What is the single most important thing that I need to do to get my city and my city's budget on a more sustainable trajectory? Yeah, so just maybe let's have a quick run through everybody. I don't know, Tracy, do you want to start?
I knew that was coming. So two things. Firstly, and this is stepping a little bit outside the mayor's world, looking beyond the world that the mayor operates within. I have never been more excited about the growing awareness and the commitment and the collaboration that is happening in this space that we have never seen before. At the same time, the urgency and the need is greater than it's ever been. And I would say, as the mayor of your city, I harness this energy to create systemic change. Don't just do pilots. Figure out ways to fundamentally rewire your system so that your budgets don't go backwards next year or the next year, so that you fundamentally avoid causing harm in where you spend your money and invest in multiple benefits in all your work, including biodiversity benefits. Good luck.
Thanks. Thank you. Alok, quickly, in a 30-second.
Yeah, just building on what Tracy said, that and I said initially, and part of our cities program is the fundamental thing is how cities are planned. And every mayor knows the importance of nature-based solutions. They know, why protecting nature is important. That needs to be translated into the plans, how cities are expanding, or how they are regenerating some of the places, or how they are seeing the natural resources as part of their overall system. And fundamental is that they don't see nature as a resource to develop infrastructure or services for cities, but nature as a source to provide those services. So I think that is the fundamental thing, which can, I'm sure, which will be very much liked by the citizens as well, because I guess for a mayor, what is the most important thing is whether people, appreciate his or her decision. And I think this is something that has been really, people will like to be closer to nature. They'll, and they would like to be part of a system which is green and clean. So there is a business case, there is an economic case, and there is a strong social case. Just do it, translate it in your planning.
Thank you. Thanks. A quick one from you, Katja.
It's going to be a bit repetitive, but I would say certainly planning is a critical issue. And as cities are going to be developing, that's really one of the main entry points, making sure that it's as green and as informed as possible. So if you have mapping of ecosystem services, identifying, biodiversity hotspots, etc., you can use that information to identify, how to do your future land use planning. I would say go through your existing budget to identify what is positive, what is negative, and what is not, and try and green that to the greatest extent. And then raise public awareness, make sure that people are aware of all the benefits. We are aware of it on a very personal level, but is it, do we see it publicized on the television, etc., somehow also to help maybe influencing the next election? These kinds of things are important too. And learn from others. Identify what are the greenest cities, what are the 10 greenest cities around the world, what have they done, what worked, what didn't, and try and borrow from their successes.
Thank you. Thanks. Mark, what would your one thing be for me to do?
I'd say work through local governments for sustainability through this group to identify where the others are. There's lots of great examples out there. And I think the best thing to do is going and talking to those people and talk to your local constituents as well. Understand what it is that they want to do. That's what's going to drive the change. It's not some big idea parachuted in. It's actually what's going to be relevant for you in the context that you're in. And that means engaging locally.
No, that's a good one. Thank you. Kimberly, the last word belongs to you.
All right, last but not least, I hope. So I think one of the things that we've been trying to do in the last few months at the World Economic Forum is really change the mindset that nature is not a nice to have. Nature is a must. And so I think, the place to start for mayors is really rethinking how they think about nature. How can restoring nature, protecting nature, really help you achieve all of your goals you want for your city and the people that are in the city. So I think that's a really important point. And because I come from the forum, I think partnerships is also key, right? Mayors can't do this alone, and there's a lot of people out there who can help them with that way. So look for those people that can help. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I certainly think I've got some really good advice here. I hope the people that have been listening in also agree. I just want to say to my panel, I've really enjoyed it. I think it's been a really stimulating and interesting panel, some good food for thought, some really nice ideas. And with that, I'm going to say also thank you to the attendees that listened in, and to all of you again, thank you for your time, and we hope to be seeing each other soon, working in partnership, reimagining our cities, getting to a nature positive, getting more investment, accounting properly for what we really are doing to our beautiful nature. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.